Well, we're here today with Scott Shane, the national security reporter for the New York Times, who hails from Baltimore and the Washington corridor these days. But he's here for a national security studies conference that's being held on April 4th and 5th of 2016 here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So welcome, Scott.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Now, today the topic is journalism and being a journalist and how you got to be where you are, which most of us would consider the pinnacle of journalism in many respects. And where'd you grow up? High school, and then you went to Williams. Kind of walk us through that.
Well, I was actually born in Georgia, stayed there very briefly, grew up mostly in Washington, D.C., went to high school there, went to Williams College in Massachusetts, did a degree in English literature, and got a little fellowship that took me to Oxford in England for 2 years, did another degree in English literature, clearly not thinking about what I was going to do with my life. Then I sort of got out of that, and I think I realized I had one sort of semi-skill, which I'd studied Russian language, but I had studied for a summer in Russia, and in those Cold War times, I wanted to be able to go back and live in Russia and work in Russia, and if you took most of the jobs that were on offer, which was CIA, Defense Department, and so on, you couldn't go live there. So I kind of had the impression that going also as a diplomat, you were very constrained in who you met and what you did in those days. And I learned somewhere that if you went as a journalist, you could maybe have a fairly normal life, meet people, get around, be fairly free. And that kind of planted a seed, and when I needed to find actual work, and literally I had not pursued journalism in college. I was an avid reader of journalism, consumer of journalism, but I hadn't really thought of it as a career. And I think my thought process was, I need a job. I've studied English. I did a lot of writing that seems to kind of overlap with journalism a little bit. And I followed around, I had a friend of a friend who was covering the Pentagon for UPI, United Press International. And he kindly agreed to let me kind of tag along for a couple days at the Pentagon. And I said, this is so cool. And I got a job. My first job in journalism was as a so-called news clerk at the old Washington Star, the afternoon paper in Washington, D.C. Long gone. Closed about a year after I was there, although I don't think I was to blame. And a news clerk in those days was one of these jobs that are common in journalism where they exploit people who want to become reporters to do this sort of clerical work around the office. And so, you know, I would change the paper on the printer, and in those days I would literally type into the system items for bake sales and church picnics and things. And I typed in even real estate transactions, like who sold their home to whom. But the great thing about it was a job designed for aspiring journalists. So when your clerical duties were sort of under control, you were allowed to work on stories that you came up with or that you got an editor to give you. And you were paid a whopping $35 per story on top of your big salary, which I think was about $9,000 a year. And so I was able to do a lot of stories and get over that thing of getting some clips to find a real job. And the first real reporting job I found, I left after about a year in D.C., and that was with the Greensboro Daily News, a kind of 7-day newspaper in North Carolina, and stayed there for about 3 years. And we had a great run of news when I was in there. Even though it's a small city, a kind of pillar of the community, president of a local hospital went off to prison in a corruption scandal. The public housing chief involved in a wonderful other scandal. We discovered that a guy who'd gotten several $1 million in grants, an academic, from the Department of Education to study developmental disability, had fabricated much of his research. So we just had, it seemed like a great run of scandals. And from there, I went to the Baltimore Sun, where I ended up staying for many years.
Baltimore Sun, of course, is a prestigious newspaper because its international and national reporting brought it up pretty close to the level of the Washington Post and the New York Times. And
yeah, certainly in those days. I mean, people be shocked by this today, but it was a very ambitious and well-resourced paper in the sort of flush days of the newspaper industry. So most of the years that I was there, they had 8 foreign bureaus, and they had about 15 people in D.C. and Washington, in a big Washington bureau. And they had usually 2 or 3 national correspondents scattered around, somebody in New York, somebody in San Francisco often. And so it was a big, ambitious paper in those days. And so that's why I stayed there many years.
And so what was your beat at that point? Had you already adopted national security as a
No, my first job there was covering Baltimore County courts. Courts is a great beat. I always recommend to people who find themselves in a downtown area with a few hours to kill to go to the courthouse and just walk in and watch what's going on, because it's so interesting. And Baltimore County is a big jurisdiction that sort of surrounds Baltimore City, and so it had, I think, 12 courtrooms, and to me it was almost like a kind of Cineplex. You'd try courtroom 3 and there'd be a murder case, and you'd watch for a while, and you'd go to courtroom 7 and there'd be a big environmental lawsuit unfolding. So there was always something interesting going on. But from that, I was asked to cover medicine, which was a great beat in those days. You were the only person covering medicine and public health for the Sun at the time. So there were and are 2 big medical research centers there, Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, and hospitals. But then there was also public health. It was the early years of the AIDS epidemic, and I did a sort of explanatory series on schizophrenia. I got to follow a little girl through brain surgery, radical brain surgery, where they move an entire hemisphere of the brain for an intractable seizure disorder. And indeed, the surgeon, who was little known at the time, who performed that surgery, more recently ran for president, Ben Carson. Oh. Ben Carson was the surgeon who carried out that operation.
Hopefully it was a successful operation.
It was very successful. She made it through, and she's still with us.
All right, so you're covering medicine for the Sun.
Yep.
And somehow you got yourself to Russia.
Yeah, actually, I was literally covering medicine, and the Moscow bureau came open for the Baltimore Sun, and I applied, and I got the job.
And you didn't need, per se, wonderful international chops and credentials to get a job in those days?
Apparently not. What I did have was language, which was kind of gave me a leg up. My Russian was somewhat rusty, but they gave me a little bit of time, and I spent a lot of time with actually a woman who was she was a Russian immigrant, married to a member of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and she was home with a new baby. So I went to her house and just practiced talking all the time, and so I could kind of hit the ground more or less able to operate in Russian when I got there. And it was my great good fortune to land there. I went for a trip in the end of '87, and then sort of permanently in early '88, 1988. And Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power a few years earlier and begun what they called perestroika and glasnost, and these kind of really sweeping reforms of the Soviet system. And I kind of landed just as they were really taking hold and things were changing at a very rapid rate.
And you wrote a book.
Yep, we lived there. I arrived with my wife and 2 kids and left and went home with a 3rd kid. So we lived in the middle of Moscow for about 3.5 years. And when I came back, I really wasn't done with the experience, which had been a terrific experience. And so I wrote a book called Dismantling Utopia about essentially chronicling the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with a particular angle, which is actually has a kind of media angle to it, which was we were there when Gorbachev, under what they called glasnost, sort of opened up the media for the first time, and Soviet citizens amazingly learned about life in the West for the first time, learned about their own history for the first time. And Gorbachev had believed it would sort of modernize the Soviet communist system. In fact, it completely destroyed the system, because people, turned out that learning the truth about Soviet history was not a great thing for the Soviet Communist Party. And so it led really to the collapse of the system.
And but for a while, Soviet Russia had really a free press, or not Soviet.
Yes,
Russia.
I mean, we're still Soviet.
Russia
yeah.
had a very free press, which is a little bit laughable some almost 15 or 18 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's I never would have imagined that they could restore, authoritarian rule. It's still not. It's certainly not at a Soviet degree of control. But I never imagined they could put that much of the toothpaste back in the tube. Under a former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin, that's kind of what's happened.
Yeah. So when you left Russia, it was about 91 or 92?
Yeah. Left at the end of 91, basically, and around the time of the final end of this, they literally brought the flag down, the Soviet flag down, on Christmas Day, as I recall, in 1991, and the Soviet Union was no more and had given birth to 16 independent countries, including independent Russia.
Yeah.
So, but that was not really when I got into. I mean, that was international, but that was not really the beginning of national security. When I came back to the States, I looked around Baltimore, and I was struck by the state of the American city, and that one in particular. And the crack epidemic had hit while we were overseas, and Baltimore was already a pretty poor city. With a lot of drugs and a lot of problems, and I saw it with fresh eyes, I think, because Russians in that period had very much idealized the United States, and I came back and was sort of horrified at what I saw, and so I spent several years actually writing about urban problems. I did a series on guns, series on juvenile crime, series on a drug corner. Still one of the periods of reporting in my life that I really enjoyed and really found very fulfilling and look back on very fondly. But after that, actually, I did the first thing that gave me a real hard look at the U.S. national security sector, and that was, I'd actually proposed it when I got back. I got back and I realized that just down the road from Baltimore, between Baltimore and Washington, is the largest American intelligence agency, the National Security Agency, the eavesdroppers, and that most people in those days, this was, I ended up writing about it in 94, 95, and so the mid-90s, and most people, even who lived around there, had no clue what it did, what it was.
Some people said it was no such agency was.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the old jokes were never say anything, or no such agency was what the initials stood for, and so and again, this was like the flush days of the Baltimore Sun, and a very ambitious editor named John Carroll, who later became editor of the LA Times, Los Angeles Times, was in charge, and I kept bugging him about this, and eventually he I think he got it because when I pointed out that this was actually Maryland, the state of Maryland's largest employer, and yet very little known. And I knew more about the Soviet KGB than I knew about the NSA when I started that project. And so
maybe you need to just backtrack.
Yeah.
I know you wrote a 6-part series, but give me 30 seconds on what the NSA is and what it does.
So what we discovered was NSA is essentially the electronic intelligence agency, was and is, although its targets have evolved rather rapidly since then, the last 20 years. But it's basically eavesdroppers. And at that time, it had maybe 30,000 employees in Maryland, but it also had somewhere around 75,000 military people. This was post-Cold War, but barely post-Cold War. And they'd been stationed all over the world. So it was a very common thing for somebody in Army intelligence or Air Force intelligence or Navy intelligence to be on a base somewhere or to be on a ship somewhere or to be in the air aboard a plane, sucking up all these electronic signals of various kinds. It's called signals intelligence, SIGINT. And so it might be, a telephone conversation, but it also might be the telemetry controlling a missile test, all kinds of stuff that all got sucked up and then brought to this big sprawling campus in Maryland. So, what was fun about that was it is a highly classified place. Everything they do is extremely secret. And I actually got detained. They have their own police force. And I was driving very slowly along the fence of one of several buildings behind this fence, trying to read any kind of signage and figure out what was going on there. And this NSA police car shows up with the siren going. And they ordered me to get out of the car, and they asked me what I'm doing. And, I tell them the truth. I say I'm a reporter. I'm with the Baltimore Sun, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on in those buildings there. And it threw them for a loop because they're accustomed to thinking it's either a tourist who's lost or it's, I don't know, a Chinese spy. But the fact that it's someone who's actually kind of spying and yet tells you who he is and what he's doing, they didn't really know what to do. And so they detained me for maybe an hour, and they kept calling bigger and bigger bosses. And finally I said, I have to go pick up my daughter. The sun was going down. It was the end of the day. I said, I have to go pick up my daughter. So if you're not going to arrest me, I'm leaving. And here's my card. And you can call NSA Public Affairs in the morning, and they'll tell you all about what I'm up to. And it turned out that NSA Public Affairs told me the next day that they'd had a complaint from the NSA police that I was caught trying to break into a secure facility. So anyway, but it was a lot of fun, and I think we ultimately did do a 6-part series, sort of 2 to 3 full inside pages every day. And it was, I think, a good little primer on what this agency did, what its history was, what some of the issues and controversies surrounding it were.
And of course, the Baltimore Sun, that was the market for the Baltimore
Absolutely.
Sun. It was the home market.
We sold, they printed up reprints of the series.
Right.
And I think we sold 11,000 copies for $6.95 each until they, quote, lost the plates and couldn't make any more. But the purchasers, I saw the purchasing list, most by far were neighbors and relatives of people who worked at NSA. Because, Dad had worked at NSA and would never talk about his work. And so his kids or his wife, whoever bought this series to sort of understand a little more about what NSA was. And but also on that list was the Chinese embassy, I remember. So there were others who were trying to learn about that agency.
Okay, and then how'd you get to the Times?
Well,
did they recruit you?
No, not exactly. I after 9/11 in 2001, like many reporters, I I had some familiarity with security and intelligence stuff by then. And so I got thrown into covering 9/11 and also into covering the anthrax attacks, the anthrax-laced letters that somebody sent around to 2 U.S. senators and media organizations right after 9/11. That became a long-running investigation and sort of criminal case. And so I was covering all that stuff for the Baltimore Sun. What was also happening, it's sort of the history of journalism, was the Baltimore Sun, which had been owned by a small number of families for many, many years, was purchased by Times Mirror, essentially the Los Angeles Times, in the 80s, and then that company, Times Mirror, was purchased by Tribune Company of Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, and Tribune was a corporate owner with an eye on the bottom line. The internet had hit newspapers sort of like a hurricane, and we were losing a lot of the advertising base to the internet. And so there were a lot of changes, and none of them were good from a business point of view. And I would say that I think the Baltimore Sun was still hanging on, but as I like to say, you could hear the noise from the waterfall ahead. And I thought, you know what, I had had opportunities to leave before, but I'd been able to come up with interesting things to do at the Sun, and I was happy there. So I started poking around and talked to both the New York Times Washington Bureau and the Washington Post. And I got a good offer from the New York Times Washington Bureau, and so in 2004 I started commuting from Baltimore to Washington to work there. And I started there pretty much as a national security reporter, and I have done that ever since.
Okay, so we have a couple of audience questions, and Ricky, are you first? Is that the number one? Yeah. Go ahead and stand up, and why don't you tell us who you are?
Hello, my name is Ricky Garcia, and I'm a journalism student. I have a couple questions. So national security and terrorism are subjects that most people would avoid reading and reporting about, but what draws you to these topics, and why did you pick the medium of a book to present it?
In some ways it was an accident of history that I happened to be with a big paper on 9/11 when suddenly everybody was very interested in this subject of national security and terrorism. And I mean, everybody out in the country was asking, what just happened, and why did it happen, what does it mean, and what's going to happen next. And so at that time it was sort of very exciting as a topic. And then I think after a while it's a somewhat challenging journalistic topic, because so much of the information is classified, and so there's always this sort of tug of war with the government to kind of dig information out about what the government is doing and what it knows. And so you develop certain sources and certain skills and a knowledge base about the intelligence agencies in the national security sector, and at that point Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's leadership and how it operated, and what the threat was and how the threat was playing out in U.S. society. And so I suppose this is true across the board in journalism, that you develop some expertise, or you get in a rut, and you tend to stay in it as long as it's entertaining. And for me, it really has been of great interest. I think the downside is that you aren't often sort of an eyewitness to things, as you might be on other beats. You're often talking to people on the phone, or you're maybe sitting in their office, but you're not out there seeing this stuff unfold for the most part. But you asked about books. I did one book on the Soviet collapse, and then more recently another book which was deliberately on terrorism. I'd been covering terrorism for a long time, and counterterrorism, and I wanted to address it at greater length and find a story to tell that sort of captured a lot of the issues that were raised in journalism, and that one did let me at least I went to Yemen, which was where the guy I was writing about, an American cleric and later terrorist named Anwar al-Awlaki, where he kind of ended up in his life with Al-Qaeda and where he was killed in a drone strike. So, you know, I got to go there and see some stuff firsthand. But, you know, I think the reason I chose a medium of a book was in part to just go into greater depth on some of the things that had struck me over the years. One was, you know, how and why does an individual become a terrorist? You know, a real sort of mystery and puzzle to me even today. And the other was, why is it that everything the U.S. has done since 9/11 in counterterrorism seems to bring with it a sort of unintended consequences, a backlash that often feeds into the advantage of Al-Qaeda or now ISIS? Why is that? How does that play out?
Okay. So how do you write a book when you're working as a full-time journalist? How does that work? Do you take a couple weeks off and get supported by your wife, or what happens?
Well, you go to a publisher and actually go to a literary agent, and you talk the literary agent into representing you, and then you talk about what you want to write about, and you come up with a book proposal. In this case, I think my book proposal was maybe 70 pages long, and it was a summary of the book, chapter outlines, and a sample chapter. Then the agent shops that around to publishers, and if you're lucky, one of them buys it and gives you a contract that gives you enough money to live on. And then you go to your bosses and say, geez, you know, could I have a book leave, an unpaid book leave? And you don't always get it. It happened that in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, 2 people were coming back from book leaves right when I was going to go out. So they granted me one, and so that's basically how I managed to do it.
Good. Thank you. Did you have another question, Ricky?
Yes. What was the most important part of being a journalist for such a well-known news organization like the New York Times?
Well, I guess the huge advantage, the obvious advantage, is that when many news organizations have struggled, excuse me, my old employer, the Baltimore Sun, has a newsroom that peaked with 420 employees late in my years there, a few years before I left. That's just the newsroom, not the business side, but just editors, reporters, photographers, and so on. It's now fewer than 100. So from 420 to I think around 90. That is a drastic reduction in staff. And so it shrank back. It closed all its foreign bureaus, where it had 15 people in Washington, it now has 1. It's basically a local paper, decent local paper that still does good work, but scaled way, way, way back. Doesn't have the county bureaus it used to have. So that's happened to many news organizations, certainly newspapers. So I feel fortunate that the Times is still hanging on, still hasn't really figured out how to support a newsroom of this size on a purely digital paper. 70% of our revenue, or maybe in the high 60s now, but close to 70% of the New York Times revenue still comes to the print edition. But the average print reader looks a little bit like Professor Schaefer and I, meaning we're not the future. And so they're still trying to figure out how you put out a newspaper online and make enough money from it to support a newsroom of, we have I think about 1,350 people in our newsroom now, which is huge. I guess the only other thing I'd mention about the advantages of working for a place like the New York Times is when you call, say, Central Intelligence Agency, Public Affairs, and say, I'm with the New York Times, they're a little more likely to sort of sit up and take notice and return your call. Not necessarily give you any information, but at least take you seriously, get you in the door by comparison, even with the Baltimore Sun where I worked before.
Now, what kind of changes have happened in your life as a journalist worker now that we've sort of entered the digital age? Mm-hmm. And The Times has these revolving deadlines, and their
Yeah.
website's very important to them. Are you tweeting constantly? How's that work?
Well, a lot of us dinosaurs have sort of been dragged into the digital age, and I guess the first thing that it doesn't affect my. Mostly, I'm working on longer-term stuff now, but for anyone who's covering daily story, the big change that happened, some years back, really, is let's say if President Obama gives a speech at 10 in the morning. In the old print days, we had basically one deadline at the end of the day. So you would go to the speech or listen to the speech. You had the rest of the day to kind of call people about it and do analysis and read background and call up people to comment on it and then you'd write your story in the afternoon and it would be edited in the in the evening and it would be in the next day's paper. Now he gives a speech, say from 10 to 10:30. Basically by 10:35 or 10:40, the New York Times wants a version of a story about that speech up on the web. So that makes it important for you to get an advance text if you can. Probably write a provisional story before the speech so you can make any changes that need to be made and pop it up right away. Then they'll usually want another version in the afternoon with a richer story, a longer story with some reaction and so on. And then they'll often want you to retop the story for a second, a second day story as they call it, for the print edition with a different lead, a sort of maybe focusing on the reaction to the speech and so on. So what does that mean? That means that instead of spending all day reporting, and then if you have a daily story, a few hours in the end of the day writing, you're sort of interrupted, your reporting is interrupted and taken up by writing all day long. And I think it does cut into reporting time in a way that can be very hard to juggle. So that's the first change. The second change, I guess, is social media. And I am on Twitter. I don't tweet all day, but I tweet on a regular basis. And I actually find it a very useful reporting tool, Twitter in particular. I don't do much with Facebook. I'm very impressed with mostly younger reporters who seem to manage to be very active on several platforms all day long and still do their job. But Twitter, I find I follow several hundred people in the kind of national security realm, and in an era where Iran's supreme leader and the Pope and the CIA all have Twitter feeds. Twitter's actually a very useful reporting tool.
How interesting. Allison, did you have a question?
Yes. Hi, so my name is Allison Hinon, and I'm also a journalist student. So as a journalist, what was the most difficult part of being involved in the trial of CIA agent John
Kiriakou.
Yeah. And I would ask you to give us about a 30-second background on that.
Yes.
And then you can go into answering
Sure.
what might have been hard for you personally.
Yeah, this was one of an unprecedented number of leak prosecutions under President Obama. In all of American history, before Obama took office in 2009, there had been, depending on how you define it, 3 cases, is what I usually say, of a current or former government employee being prosecuted for leaking classified information to the press. And those were all kind of peculiar cases, and it was so rare to be almost non-existent, in other words. But under Obama, I believe we're up to 8 such prosecutions, and it's an interesting question as to why that happened. I don't have the impression that Obama actually sat down and said he wanted to do this. I think in some ways it's a sort of result of changing technologies more than anything else. But so you had, 2 of the cases are famous ones. Bradley Manning, the young Army private who was working as an intelligence officer in Iraq, who took hundreds of thousands of secret documents and gave them to WikiLeaks. And then Edward Snowden, the contractor with the National Security Agency, who flew off to Hong Kong a few years ago, with laptops loaded with highly secret, top secret NSA documents, and gave them to journalists. And so those are the two most famous ones, but there's 6 others less well known. One of those is John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou worked for the CIA for 14 years. He began as an analyst, an intelligence analyst, but then wanted to get into the operations side, the kind of what people think of essentially as the spying side. So he became a counterterrorism agent for the CIA. He's of Greek heritage and speaks fluent Greek. So he worked out of Athens for some years on counterterrorism, traveling around Europe and the Middle East. Then he was back at headquarters for a while. Then after 9/11, he started pestering them actually to let him go back into the field. And he worked as a counterterrorism agent out of Pakistan, in Pakistan, after 9/11, extremely dangerous circumstances, trying to recruit people who could, as a CIA officer, you recruit agents. The agents are not the CIA employees. The agents are usually the foreign officials or maybe even foreign terrorists who are working secretly for the CIA and giving information. So he did that. He was very good at it by all costs, by all accounts, and he actually was in on the capture of the first big terrorist, really a guy who was sort of a travel agent for terrorists in the region, a guy who went by the name Abu Zubaydah. And it was the first big capture by the CIA after 9/11. And he was one of the first people to talk to this guy. Abu Zubaydah had been shot when he was in the middle of being captured. So he was in his hospital bed. And this guy, John Kiriakou, who spoke by then good Arabic, had the first conversations with him. So time passes. He actually retired from the agency and was working for various sort of national security private firms. And he became a source of mine. He went on television, talked about waterboarding, that torture technique that became a subject of the news after about 2005 or 6. And he was the first former CIA officer to talk on television in an open interview, in a public interview, under his own name about waterboarding. And so he got a lot of attention at that point. And a lot of us sort of went to him and started talking to him about terrorism, about other things. And I was one of those reporters. So he was later, I was actually sitting at my computer one day and reading my email, and up pops a Justice Department press release. And the headline says, former CIA officer John Kiriakou charged. And, my vision got blurry, and I opened it up. And I read through the criminal charge papers, and there I was, identified as journalist B, not by name, but it was obvious who I was because it cited a newspaper story that I had written with the headline and the date. So it wasn't very well hidden. And he was accused of leaking classified information to me and to several other reporters. It was a horrifying experience, much worse for him. I mean, to make a long story short, he eventually agreed to plead guilty because he had a young family, young kids, and they were threatening him with 10, 15 years in prison. And so he accepted a plea deal for 30 months in federal prison, and he served it. He went off to prison. First CIA officer to be charged and convicted and serve a prison sentence for leaking to the American press. In my opinion, it was while I think it was fair to say that he technically violated the law, the kinds of violations that he was charged with and that he was guilty of were the kind of thing that had been completely routine in national security reporting literally for decades. And so to my way of thinking, it was really an unfair and unjustified prosecution. But to be on the, to be part of that and to see your own emails with this guy quoted verbatim in the charging papers against him was certainly an experience I will never forget.
So, as a national security correspondent or reporter, you've got to do a lot of off-the-record, on-background kinds of things. How do you negotiate that? I mean, most of your sources, is this, if you can look up in a journalism textbook, it tells you these things, it's hard and fast.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? How do you do that? And how do you get people to talk to you about national security when there's a sense that the government, maybe some people sometimes call it Bigfoot's ready to come down, and yet you need that information. So how do you deal with that?
Well, it's I guess an acquired skill. I guess I think of it as sort of concentric circles around a topic. Let's take drone strikes, something that is in this gray area. Technically speaking, the drone program in Pakistan is a covert action program, highly secret, and in fact, technically speaking, government officials are not allowed to confirm or deny the existence of the CIA's drone program in Pakistan. On the other hand, in the real world, stuff blows up, missiles fall from the sky. It's not secret from the people on the ground who are being hit with missiles. And in fact, in the real world, President Obama has found it necessary or desirable to speak publicly about this program. And so you reach a situation where somebody like Michael Hayden, the former director of both NSA and CIA, who actually was CIA director when that program was sort of ramped up, escalated in the end of 2008, he has said publicly, he's now out of office, he said publicly he no longer knows what he's allowed to say and not say about the drone program. But if I want to write about the drone program, what do I do? Well, there are certain people I can call. There are people in the outside world, either former officials or sort of experts in the private sector, who I can call up and we'll talk to a degree. There is CI Public Affairs, which at different times has been willing to give a little bit of information, especially if you bring information to them. So if you say, for example, there are reports in the Pakistani press that a CIA drone strike in this village killed a family of 5, these are innocent people, what do you have to say about that? On occasion, it's been possible to get the CIA or other people in the government to say, on background usually, not for attribution, to say, well, our information is that that was not a family of 5 innocent people. That was actually an Al-Qaeda cell, and we believe there were 7 people killed. And literally, you'll sometimes get these completely contradictory, conflicting versions of the strike. But you'll sort of work in closer and closer to the harder and harder targets, and you'll put together what you can. And sometimes you'll find that no one will speak on the record, and everybody's speaking on background. They want to be identified as, sometimes you can't even get them to say a CIA official, you can only get them to say a US official, or an administration official, or a White House official. So you negotiate that kind of stuff. But one thing I have found over the years is that sometimes you can talk people into putting some stuff on the record, and that it really helps your story if you can get named people in the story. Because a story that's loaded with anonymous sources, I think, comes across as having less credibility than a story that has some named sources. So sometimes you can go back to someone and say, look, here's what I want to quote you as saying, something they said. You read it back to them, and they'll say, okay, you can quote me as saying that. But you know, in the wake of these 8 prosecutions for leaking to the press, for so-called leaking to the press, for unauthorized disclosures to the press, you know, it has been more difficult to get people to speak, period, let alone on the record. The way I think of it is that there is this kind of gray zone between the classified and the unclassified. And that is, and drone strikes are a very good example of that. And I think traditionally what happens is the reporter and the source, the official or former official, kind of meet in that gray zone and negotiate, you know, what information can be turned over. And the official usually does it. They may do it out of ego. They may do it out of wanting to, you know, because they're unhappy with their particular policy, a sort of whistleblower motive. But I think a lot of times they do it because they accept that we're a democratic country and there's value when the public is informed about even the most secret activities of the government. And so they do it in a way out of a patriotic motive. But if they're threatened with prison for entering this gray zone, which is a little bit hard to judge. Like I said, John Kiriakou was prosecuted and sent to prison for stuff that was pretty routine in national security journalism. So if they're running that risk, I mean, who knows what the rules are then? And so why should they enter that gray zone and meet with you and talk to you at all? What's in it for them? Not much. And so it becomes harder. There's this chilling effect. And you find people who were once willing to talk about stuff a little less willing. And some people who haven't been willing, you know, they say, are you kidding me? Why should I?
So have you ever had people who were talking to you on background or off the record, and it turns out that those people lied to you, maybe even about their job and what they were and where they were, and how do you deal with things like that? So for example, somebody who says they're State Department, then you look up in the State Department roster and they don't exist. Things like that.
I mean, that's happened occasionally. I have to say it's happened in non-national security journalism as well. So it's something you have to be wary of no matter what the subject is. People will lie to you, and it's hard to get used to. Even being a reporter 30-something years, and having been lied to, I'm sure, for most of those 37 years, I think it's still a little bit hard when someone looks you in the eye and tells you something. You know, the first thing that passes through your head is not, this guy's lying to me. In some situations, you recognize there's a motive and you're warier about it. But I guess what you do is you try to test the person's knowledge. Usually you bring to the subject, if you've been reporting on something for a while, some background knowledge, so you can put some questions to the person, and if they don't seem to have answers, you may be suspicious about whether they ever worked for the CIA, for example. I've had people tell me they worked for the CIA who'd never worked for the CIA. I've had people who worked for NSA who told me they did certain things, they hadn't done those things. So, you know, you can test their knowledge. You can also go to other people. There was actually just a news story that went around Washington where a guy who I knew and had met and had talked to, fortunately I'd never quoted him in a story, but he had posed as a former covert CIA operative with sort of paramilitary experience, and he had been on TV, especially Fox News, many times to comment on terrorism and other issues. Turned out he was a complete fraud from beginning to end. And so you got to be careful.
It's probably a professor job for him out there. So, have you heard the term big-footed? Do you have a definition for that?
Yeah, I mean, usually we use it in in the newspaper business as usually I've heard it used as a junior reporter, gets a tip or begins to work on a subject, and all of a sudden some much more experienced reporter comes in and says, "Out of the way, kid, I'm going to take over this story." That's what we call being big-footed on a story.
Anything else you'd like to add? Well, first let me ask you, so you're covering all these things. Do you ever get paranoid? I mean, maybe the old Woody Allen joke, Paranoia doesn't mean they're not coming after you, right?
Yeah, not really. You know, I feel I've worked overseas and I've known a lot of foreign reporters from different countries. And I've always felt very fortunate to work in a country, to work as a journalist in a country where I feel empowered to really get in the face of very powerful government officials, for example, without any fear that they are going to say, hey, take this guy away and lock him up, you know, interrogate him, torture him, kill him. And that is a realistic prospect in many countries in the world to this day. So I really have not felt that kind of fear. In recent years, to some degree, certainly working overseas, I felt some fear for people who talked to me. And sometimes it was quite justified, like Russians who would talk to me when I was living in Moscow, were sometimes at some risk from their own government. And more recently, with this leak prosecution stuff, I've been much more careful in recent years not to put anything sensitive into an email, to be very careful about any kind of record of any transaction with somebody who might be giving me sensitive information and might be in jeopardy himself. But personally, I rarely feel much concern.
Well, that's good. In the 30 seconds or so we have left, if you had one piece of advice, and please don't say plastics, to give to aspiring journalists, what would it be?
You know, I'd say it's a sort of topsy-turvy world out there now. There are a lot of jobs in journalism that are sort of digital and web-based, a lot of startups and things. Some of them don't pay very well, some don't pay at all. Some of those organizations are going to go out of business. But I think there's always going to be a need for the public to be informed about what's going on in the world. And it really is, despite the downsides, which may be visible to someone trying to break in, it is a great job, you know, to be, for a curious person, to be curious about something, about how things work, about where the power lies, and to be paid to go look into it. That's a great job.
Well, Scott Shane from the New York Times, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now we just...
Now we pretend to...